Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and let's have a little look on the other side of the Atlantic where I want to talk about Donald Trump and his effect on our focusing on the wrong type of extremism when it comes to protecting citizens' lives. Now, last week I saw a tweet from someone based in Florida of a business, a local business, and it was a clear threat against basically anyone who doesn't represent their views and therefore they consider a valid target. And yes, those targets are likely to be other Americans. But that's okay. They're not really Americans because they don't agree with the sort of America that they want. And that's how these people rationalise monstrous behaviour and have done in a number of countries throughout history. Note the Bible quote at the top. No, it's not "thou shalt not kill." But they conveniently get around that. People they are threatening to kill and may kill, I guess they think are not God's children, they will say to themselves. But the quote is actually rather lovely. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. Marvellous quote, and one that all right-minded opponents of Donald Trump would take to heart, not out of any religious edicts, but out of good old-fashioned morality. But as with everything else, this is a quote that has been subverted. Somehow it's been used to project darkness onto a nation and from there the world. The same business in question had apparently publicly called for the murder of what they saw as political opponents, with the same quote above it. And what of the local residents? By all accounts, they don't allow this business to keep it up because they're too shy to say anything. They're comfortable with it. The business is saying what they think anyway. There's a church next to this business which doesn't object because they agree as well. Now, this twisted offence to Christianity wasn't caused by Donald Trump, of course. It's been evident in this part of the world since before the devil spawned him. And indeed, you see it around the world and throughout history. But he is responsible for ramping up the rhetoric and allowing more people to feel that their heinous views are shared with the majority of people, which is always a dangerous thing. It's a bit like the gun laws, I expect. By all accounts, a majority of Americans feel that gun laws should be stricter. But it's not people that control government, but wealthy lobbyists. In 2017, a British journalist was assaulted by a congressman. Donald Trump, far from condemning the act, later said, "Any guy that can do a body slam, he's my guy." Praise for the assault of Trump's opponents. And few are as close to the top of the list of his enemies as journalists who call him out on all his lies. The President of the United States has said that assaulting journalists is not only acceptable, but praiseworthy. Now, what is that going to do to people who already have a shaky grasp on reality as it is, and an arsenal at home? Every few months, there are more reports of counter-terrorism experts bemoaning Donald Trump for inspiring more and more right-wing violence. Right-wing terrorists and attempted terrorists have been citing Donald Trump as inspiration for their actions at an increasing rate, including, most recently, the attacker in New Zealand. But with these attacks, they've mostly been occurring in the United States itself, of course. Donald Trump keeps talking about the need to keep Muslims out because they represent a threat to Americans, of keeping Mexicans out because they represent a threat to Americans, all the while aiming to take billions from a security budget which is actually going to be used to protect America. But the facts of terrorism resulting in American deaths and injuries, or intended to cause such carnage but are being foiled, are perpetrated by far right-wing Americans. Not that they are referred to as terrorists, they're just referred to as murderers. If the media even refers to them at all. The vast majority of attacks are perpetrated by far right-wing American white men, attacking what they see as enemies of their position on one end of a political spectrum. But although they may simply be dismissed as mentally ill and lone wolves by the far-right establishment, they keep taking their inspiration from their violent rhetoric that these politicians use deliberately to whip up a frenzy of support. It's like they have no actual arguments for their cause, so they need to convince Americans that they are their protector against the enemy within. And the enemy within are their neighbours. And not all such murders are even classed as murders. The stand your ground laws in some states that allows the killing of defenceless black Americans with impunity, as the only defence seems to need to be that they perceived themselves as being threatened by these defenceless citizens. But these sort of feelings and actions, as I said, were in evidence before Trump, and excused in part by his predecessors as they rushed to reject all responsibility, but kept up their rhetoric anyway. But Donald Trump is different. He refuses to condemn the acts. He even applauds it if he thinks he can get away with it. He calls for violence against his enemies at his rallies and then says he's only joking if people pull him up on it later. But they don't pull him up on it in earshot of the people he's just incited to violence. And those people are unlikely to read the sort of newspapers that report on this. And he doesn't just talk about political opponents as enemies, which is a dangerous enough thing to do in a country where most citizens can easily acquire an almost unlimited range of weaponry. He even spells out what they should do about it. He doesn't just say, those people are your enemies, elect me and I'll deal with them. No, he says, those people are your enemies. You should do something about it. Maybe with those guns you've all got. Oh, and by the way, elect me as well. The Air Force One burgers are amazing. When Trump came to office, one of the first things he did was divert resources away from investigating right-wing extremism and focusing it entirely on Islamic extremism. Now, Islamic-inspired terror has accounted for the loss of some American lives, but not even close to those lost to right-wing American white supremacists. So now the American authorities have even less chance of preventing such deaths of innocent Americans on their own soil. The Anti-Defamation League calculated that 83% of extremist-related murders in the US, in other words, fatal acts of terrorism, let's call them for what they are, were carried out by white supremacists. But the current administration focuses all their efforts on Islamic terrorism. They cut programs which aim to avert these crises by preventing the acts of terrorism before they happen as well, so that's no longer funded. And the language used by the American media also helps shift the spotlight away from the real problem. Every single time these events are referred to as murders, and even then only if they're sure a court would convict it as such. It's only terrorism if they're not white. A man of Arab descent, for example, crashing their car into a tree will be labelled as an attempted act of terrorism before the authorities have even checked just to see if they got a puncture. But a white man gunning down a congregation will have the authorities say that they need more time to really work out what happened. But America is very powerful and it's a very influential nation. On one level, we could say, well, Americans have voted for this lunatic, so it's their own fault. But these acts of normalising violence spread beyond their shores. People listen to Trump. He may not be their president, but he is referred to around the world as the leader of the free world. And they want to be so free of anyone that doesn't think like them. And every time he inspires someone to murder Muslims at prayer, what effect will that have on the lunatics on the extreme wings of Islamic belief? They will wish to respond in kind, and when they do, he will point to it as proof that he was right all the time. And you end up with a vicious cycle that never ends until someone puts the brakes on. But in the polarised world of American politics, what are the chances of that ever happening? The time when John McCain told a rally of his own supporters that Obama wasn't a monster or someone to fear, but an honourable man with whom he disagreed, are surely long gone. The schism in American life, mirroring that in Britain at the moment, will not go until people at the top reach across to each other, or at the very least, when a majority of the population realise the damage that has been done to them. But those people at the top have too much to gain from maintaining that chasm between them. At least in Britain, weapons of mass murder are extremely difficult to acquire, as they soon will be in New Zealand. But Americans themselves are in far more danger.